Okay, welcome to lecture 23. Still got a few things to say about Marx on alienation, but we're going to be moving ahead into Marx's later critique of capitalism. See how far I get with that in this lecture. I'm going to do my best. So I was talking a good deal about how Marx understood alienation. This is an idea that he gets from Hegel, very influenced by one of Hegel's critics, Ludwig Feuerbach. Let me say something very important about how Marx understood alienation. Don't make the mistake of thinking of alienation in Marx's sense as a psychological phenomenon. It's not, for Marx, a feeling or a mental state. I mean, we often talk about alienation that way. We say we come back from a party and we felt miserable and bored. And we say, look, I felt very alienated. I didn't feel like I belonged. That's not how Marx really understands alienation as a kind of psychological state. For Marx, as I was trying to emphasize in the last lecture, alienation is a kind of social and political fact. And it's a fact about the relation between agents, their powers, and their needs. One is alienated to the extent that one's powers are exercised in ways that prevent the realization of one's own needs. That's the state of alienation. It's a fact about the relationship between powers and needs and the way in which those are misaligned under certain circumstances. Now, I was talking a good deal in the last lecture about Feuerbach and his influence on Marx. As you know, and you'll have gotten a sense of this, I hope, from the readings too, Marx is fundamentally sympathetic to Feuerbach, and he credits Feuerbach with demystifying religion, because Feuerbach gives this very powerful explanation of religion as the alienation of human powers. For Feuerbach, religion is something that human powers themselves create. We create religion. They're simply social constructions that human beings have built up. And of course, they take the form of beliefs, they take the form of doctrines, but they also take the form of rituals and practices, modes of worship, activities. And Feuerbach, of course, argues, as we saw in the last lecture, that religion involves alienation because human powers are invested in constructing a whole ideology, a whole system of belief, a whole system of piety and practice that then boomerangs back and limits humans' conception of their own needs and powers. Right? We start thinking of ourselves as needing salvation, for example, and we invest more and more of our lives in activities associated with our church or our denomination. We pray, we alter the way we organize our life in order to live in a more godly, pious kind of way, right? And Marx thinks Feuerbach is absolutely on target in thinking of religion as alienating in that way, because it involves the exercise of human powers that then limit our perception of our needs in various ways. Marx also thinks, as you know, that Feuerbach's move completely devastates Hegel's project, because Feuerbach, Marx thinks, has exposed Hegel's postulation of this semi-divine, conceptual, mental Weltgeist, this world spirit, as itself an alienating illusion. In Hegel, we find ourselves, we find our true spirit, our true nature, our true needs, Marx complains, only in a projected, abstract, philosophically conceived realm of ideas, or what he would call ideology. Realization of our true needs is, for Hegel, a merely mental relationship between ourselves and our philosophical understanding of who we are and what our activities mean. And that means, according to Marx, that Hegel is vulnerable to Feuerbach's critique, because far from reappropriating our powers and reappropriating our sense of what we truly need, the Hegelian project merely encourages us to buy into various alienating ideological illusions that then limit our conception of what we really need, what our true interests are, and so on and so forth. So for both Feuerbach and Marx, the key is to overcome all of this illusion, all of these ideological ways in which we think of our powers and our needs. To overcome that is something that is common to both Feuerbach and Marx. They both want to read human freedom back into the material conditions of life. They both want to physically reappropriate these various alienated powers so that they are properly aligned with our real needs and real interests. And that's something that both Feuerbach and Marx share. But Marx is himself dissatisfied with Feuerbach's own rendering of this materialist approach. As you know, especially from the theses on Feuerbach, which I asked you to read actually for last week, he regards Feuerbach's materialism as merely old materialism. And what does he mean by that? What I think he's getting at is that Feuerbach is in many ways a traditional Baconian empiricist. Go all the way back to Francis Bacon at the beginning of the semester, right? Well, how do we get control of our environment? Well, we do good science. We do experiments. We investigate the workings of nature, and we try to devise technocratic means whereby, in the light of the best available science and technology, we can figure out how to promote our own ends and needs. And Marx worries that Feuerbach remains committed to a kind of materialism that is basically utilitarian in outlook. Right? He associates this old materialism with the position taken, for example, by the Owenite socialists. Right? Owen was this important socialist reformer in Britain who set up in New Lanark in Scotland a somewhat more enlightened mill factory in which he tried to educate his workers into a slightly better form of existence. Owen, as you perhaps know, was very interested in, as were the classical utilitarians, in the way in which psychological socialization and the education system can be manipulated so as to improve individuals' prospects of achieving their personal ends. And Marx's worry about all of this, Feuerbach, Bacon, utilitarians, the Owenite socialists, is that this is basically a technocratic approach to human improvement. And that, he thinks, is the old materialism. And that old materialism is what he wants to overcome, because he thinks of this utilitarian old materialism as itself infected by bourgeois capitalist ideology. It simply generalizes the relation of utility or mutual exploitation. That's the meaning of Marx's closing sentences in the theses on Feuerbach, where he says Feuerbach's old materialism represents the standpoint of civil society. Bürgerliche Gesellschaft is the German term. Bürgerliche is just the German word for bourgeois, right? Part of what Marx is getting at here is that he thinks that capitalism has indeed reappropriated some human powers. It is indeed correcting a tendency for human powers to be alienated and seeks to reappropriate them. But it's engaging in reappropriation in a technocratic, empiricist, cost-benefit analysis kind of way. And he thinks that this, of course, represents the outlook of bourgeois management, right? The managerial class that runs production and investment in a capitalist economy. And that's why, of course, he regards utilitarianism as just capitalist ideology, because he thinks that the utilitarian emphasis on calculating overall benefits, minimizing costs, maximizing benefits. That whole utilitarian approach, Marx thinks, simply generalizes the standpoint of capitalist employers, people who own the means of production, and I'll say more about that, and who are constantly striving to minimize costs and maximize benefits for them. And Marx, as we'll see, thinks that has indeed reappropriated some human powers, but it doesn't get us all the way. We need a new materialism that is intended to overcome this technocratic utilitarian approach. And the need for this new materialism, Marx thinks, comes about because when we look carefully at capitalism, we'll discover that there are unacknowledged forms of alienation that require us to transcend this merely technocratic, managerial cost-benefit analysis approach to human improvement and human emancipation. So it's important for Marx that we pay attention to the ways in which capitalism itself alienates human powers and will continue to alienate human powers as long as it remains committed, as he thinks the bourgeois managerial class, of course, are, to a merely technocratic form of materialism in which we seek to exploit each other to meet our merely personal, individualized goals and ends. So he needs, in order to motivate this new materialism, he needs a diagnosis of distinctively capitalist alienation. And as we move into a discussion of Marx's criticisms of capitalism, you should keep in mind that that's his project. He wants to expose the distinctive form of alienation that arises under capitalist conditions. To anticipate a little bit, Marx thinks that under capitalism, alienation emerges in the exploitative relation that develops between two basic economic classes. The bourgeoisie, those who own capital, those who are in a position to invest money and wealth in economic production, and the workers, the class of laborers, whom the bourgeoisie seeks to hire as part of their investment strategy, right? So in capitalism, you have an exploitative relationship, Marx thinks, developing between these two basic economic classes. The bourgeoisie, who own the capital, own the means of production, actually organize investment and production, and the workers, those who have nothing to sell but their labor. And he thinks that these conditions are alienating under capitalism in at least three senses, because under these conditions, agents are, first of all, alienated from their products, right? What workers produce under capitalism doesn't represent the workers' own intentions for their own products, right? Marx here is assuming, what I think most of you will be prepared to concede, that one of our most basic human needs is the creative need, right? The need to see ourselves expressed in the products of our own labor. So if you think of a medieval cobbler under the feudal mode of production, right? I mean, the cobbler is, of course, going to be much less wealthy in many cases than many people in under capitalist conditions, and production of shoes under feudalism is going to be a lot less efficient than the mass production of shoes in factories run by Nike and companies like that under capitalist conditions. But at least it's the case for the medieval cobbler working away in his workshop that every day he can say, look, I've produced a certain number of shoes. I designed these shoes. I made them. Those shoes represent me. They represent my labor, how I make shoes, and I can take a certain kind of pride in that production. But of course, if you're a worker on the factory assembly line, it's going to be much more difficult for you to think of the results of your daily labor in quite that way, because all you've done on the assembly line is repetitively perform some relatively trivial task. You get to turn the screw or attach the chip to the circuit board on the iPhone as it comes along the assembly line. And all you can say at the end of your 12 hours of work on the assembly line is that you've plugged in 1,000 of these little chips onto the circuit board. And that doesn't really represent anything that you've designed. You can't particularly take any pride in the particular product of your labor. And that's one form of alienation. Your powers don't any longer, under capitalism, express anything of who you are, and that your powers are therefore not meeting one of your fundamental human needs, which is the need to see yourself externalized in the object of your own work, the object of your own labor. Marx also thinks that under capitalism, workers are alienated. This is all in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, by the way. Workers are alienated from the organization of production itself. The people who organize large-scale production in factories are different from the people who are then asked to perform particular roles within the factory, to fulfill particular tasks. And this, as Adam Smith had already noticed in his discussion in The Wealth of Nations, this is often profoundly dehumanizing. Again, if you think of the assembly line, right, the way the assembly line is organized is set up by the managers. It's set up by the technocrats in the background. You, as a worker on the assembly line, are simply slotted into that system, right? It's like the Charlie Chaplin picture that I put on the top of the syllabus, right? You just become assimilated to this larger machine, right? And you're simply slotted into the machine. You just become a cog in a much, much wider and incredibly complicated economic machine, and you are alienated from the organization of production itself. Your powers are assimilated to the needs of the system and not something that represents anything about you any longer. And that's a second form of alienation. Thirdly, and here he's getting a concept that I have alluded to at various points in the earlier lectures, Marx says workers under capitalism are alienated from Gattungswesen, from species being. The point here, it's hard to get, but it's really, really important. Remember in the last lecture, I was stressing that for Marx, a capitalist economy is already a form of communism, right? Because a capitalist economy is a global communal system into which we are all involuntarily enrolled. If we're born into a capitalist society, we have to assimilate to it. And it represents the communal life of the species trying to provide for itself at a particular epoch in the history of the human species, right? And so it's important, Marx thinks, since this represents our communal powers being organized collectively in a certain kind of way, it's important, if we're not to be alienated from those powers, that those powers be exercised in ways that are consistent with and help to realize our real human individual needs and interests, right? But under capitalism, Marx says, that's not what happens. In fact, what happens is that we are alienated from the communal life of the species, and we are therefore alienated, as he puts it, from species being. In that, the economy becomes this abstract system that is treated merely as a means for the realization of many, many different individual goals and ends. And that might be unproblematic if the economy were indeed just a kind of independent object or a resource, right? If the economy was an independent object like a lake or a piece of land or the sea, right, then it wouldn't really be problematic to treat this thing as something that is available for us to meet our various needs. But an economy is our species being, right? The economy as such just is the human species constructing, exercising its own powers in very, very complicated ways in order to provide for its needs, right? The economy, therefore, is nothing other than human beings. It's just human beings, their labor, their hopes, their communal self-organization. And under capitalism, Marx is going to argue, human individuals are alienated from that communal self-organization because their powers are commandeered by that form of species being in the form of the economy. And then the powers that are then alienated to the economy reflect back on individuals, and we are then expected to kowtow, to assimilate ourselves to its needs, right? And that, again, for Marx, is a form of alienation, and therefore a form of unfreedom, because our powers are now being directed back against us as a set of forces that limit our own ambitions, our own goals, our own interests, our own needs, right? And this is going to be very important, as you'll see, when we talk about the Marxist criticisms of capitalism more specifically. Notice a couple of things about these three forms of alienation that Marx mentions. Notice that really it's only the first of these, number one on your slide there, that is strictly speaking about the predicament of manual laborers, right? The medieval cobbler who's at least able to say, look, at the end of the day, I've produced three beautiful shoes and I can take a certain kind of pride in that. That meets a certain kind of need that I have to affirm myself through my labor, right? The other two, of course, will also affect the predicament of manual laborers, but they're not only about the predicament of manual laborers, because everybody else who's involved in the capitalist system, Marx thinks, whether they're manual laborers or pursuing a degree in the com school and want to become super efficient bourgeois managers in the capitalist system, 2 and 3 will also affect them, right? What kinds of skills they're expected to develop, what kinds of things go into the curriculum of the com school here, right? They're going to be determined by what the economy needs, right? The economy needs super astute bourgeois managers, and so Marx would say what's going on in the McIntyre School of Commerce and business schools around the place is the cultivation of particular skills that the economy needs and that stand in no particular relationship to the needs of individuals. So, when students at UVA feel this overwhelming peer pressure, which many of you will yourself have felt in coming to UVA to kind of enroll in the com school, right? That kind of that kind of sense that what you really want to do is to join the com school and learn how to be a bourgeois manager, right? That for Marx is a classic example of alienation, right? Because it's the system and the prestige associated with becoming a bourgeois manager, right, that is inducing people to want to be a certain kind of person, right? And it's not obvious, Marx thinks, that wanting to be that kind of person is genuinely reflective of who you are and what you could achieve in your life, as opposed to what the capitalist economy requires people to be like. So notice that 2 and 3 there are as much a concern about alienation for the sake of non-manual laborers, people who become members of the managerial class, as they are worries about manual laborers working in factories. That's important for you to keep in mind. Notice too, and this is really important, I can't stress this enough, this business about alienation from species being. Once you get this thought that for Marx, capitalism is already a communal system, it's already a collective formation, right, that exists in the world and organizes ultimately the whole global economy. It is the species being of the human community and its need to satisfy various kinds of requirements under given historical conditions, right? Once you see that that's Marx's picture of capitalism, it's easier to understand something that I think is extremely important, right? Marx is very often portrayed, this is another of the myths and legends about him, that Marx is often portrayed as a kind of collectivist, right? Someone who basically doesn't care about individual well-being and is prepared to subordinate individuals to the needs of some collective system, right? But that's not Marx's view at all, right? Because Marx's actual objection to capitalism is precisely that it is a form of problematic collectivist subordination. As he says on page 86 of your reader, one of the things you've got to avoid is re-establishing an idea of society as an abstraction vis-a-vis the individual, right? Because if you focus on what the communal system needs first, and then expect everybody else to assimilate themselves to that communal system, then you will alienate and oppress people. And Marx thinks that's exactly what happens in capitalism, right? Capitalism is a complicated communal system of economic reproduction, right? And we are made to serve its needs rather than the other way around. And liberation and appropriation, reappropriation of these powers for Marx, is precisely intended as an effort to reappropriate on behalf of individuals those powers that the system exercises on its behalf and forces everybody into its mold because it's trying to reproduce itself. That's precisely the kind of collectivism that Marx is struggling against. And he thinks that's what we've got to overcome, right? So capitalism for Marx is already a kind of problematic collectivism, a system of impersonal economic reproduction that subordinates agents and their lives to its needs. Whereas it should be, if we were genuinely free, if our species being were truly liberated, emancipated, it would be the other way around. We would think of the economy not as an alienated formation of powers that are limiting our human possibilities. Rather, we would simply think of it as something that we can use together to meet all of our genuine needs and interests together. But that, Marx thinks, is precisely not what happens in capitalism. In capitalism, we are enrolled in this collective project of shoring up the capitalist communal system, and we are all expected to serve it rather than the system of economic reproduction being made to serve our individual needs. So it's very, very important to keep that in mind. Now, let me turn to discuss some of Marx's more specific objections and criticisms of capitalism. First of all, I've alluded to this already. Keep in mind that Marx, although he is certainly a critic of capitalism, he is greatly impressed by it and in many ways quite sympathetic to it. As I've already stressed in this lecture, he regards capitalism as itself accomplishing some reappropriation of human powers, and he thinks that has a genuinely emancipatory force. So he thinks of capitalism as a progressive advance, right? He's no friend of feudalism. He doesn't want to go back to feudalism. And he credits the capitalist bourgeoisie with clearing away what he calls the medieval rubbish of feudalism and its silly hierarchical ordering of society. Capitalism dissolves these traditional feudal loyalties, paves the way for a truly global communal order. And that, for Marx, is a genuine step forward. It's genuinely emancipatory and progressive. If Marx were around today, he would certainly be with the neoliberal globalizers, not the nationalist protectionists, right? It's very, very important to keep that in mind. He would have almost certainly analyzed Trump-style protectionist nationalism, right, as a step backwards towards something neo-feudal. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx speaks of free trade as the unconscionable freedom. So he's certainly against capitalist free trade in a certain kind of way. And yet he speaks very much in its favor as opposed to various forms of economic protectionism. And I've put in Collab, I didn't assign this, but I thought it might be useful for you to see, his famous speech, I think it's 1848, certainly from that period anyway, a speech he gives to a conference of workers defending free trade and attacking protectionism. Marx is in that sense with the capitalist globalizers because he thinks that capitalist globalization has brought about this realization that the economy is genuinely ours, where the relevant we is the whole of humanity globally, right? And that's a huge step forward, right? It's focusing attention on our communal mode of self-reproduction. Capitalism, too, is genuinely emancipatory, genuinely promotes freedom. I'll say more about this in a moment, but one of the great accomplishments of capitalism, Marx thinks, is that it gets rid of slavery, right? It abolishes formal enslavement as a way of exploiting people, whereas, of course, serfdom, slavery have dominated economic modes of life in the pre-modern period. That's why, interestingly, some of his writings, I don't think it's anywhere in the assignments that I've given you, but Marx does say this at various points. He regarded the American Civil War as a moment in the capitalist revolution because it was this late phase during which this hangover from previous epochs, a system of formal slavery, was eventually wiped away. But of course, he thinks it was wiped away in order to pave the way for capitalism and the freedom of the bourgeoisie. But he recognizes that it's a good thing, it's a major step forward, that we figured out a way to feed ourselves and meet our collective needs without having to formally own other human beings as slaves, right? And he thinks that's a genuine step forward, genuinely emancipatory. I'll talk about on the Jewish question in a later lecture, but just to foreshadow this, Marx thinks that the capitalist revolution has liberated politics in a way, right? It's allowed civil society, the realm of the economy, to assert itself as an arena for human development, independently of excessive central control by a centralized state. And he thinks that's a very good thing. He's all in favor of that. And of course, Marx thinks that capitalism has enormously enhanced human power, right? Capitalist development has spurred incredible technological scientific innovation beyond all possible imagination of members of previous epochs. It's helped to undermine religious dogma and religious illusion, and enormously increased human powers to solve important, genuine material needs and physical problems, right? So there's lots about capitalism that Marx thinks is progressive and good and emancipatory. So when you think about his criticism of capitalism, don't think of him, again, as just having a naive view in which everything that capitalism has accomplished is being regarded as unconditionally bad. That's very, very far from Marx's view. Nonetheless, he does want to say that capitalism has built into it certain fundamental forms of oppression, certain fundamental forms of unfreedom and alienation, and that's what he's trying to bring to light. Notwithstanding all of its other amazing accomplishments, capitalism remains a system of domination. So the story of the emancipation of human species being is not yet complete. So with that, let me now turn to some of the details of Marx's economic critique of capitalism. This is the aspect of his thought that he develops much more fully in his mature later writings, and especially in his masterwork, Das Kapital, which of course he never completely finishes, but some excerpts from which are in your reader, and I'm going to be talking about the analysis that Marx reaches in the lead up to that book and articulates in Capital. A couple of technical terms about Marx's view, first of all. Marx distinguishes between forces of production, relations of production, and means of production. When he speaks of the forces of production, he's referring to the set of powers that are available, set of human powers that are available at any historical moment to meet human needs, right? Things like tools, technology, what we today might call human capital, the acquisition of certain forms of know-how, certain kinds of skills, certain kinds of crafts, certain kinds of technology, and so forth. That's what Marx has in mind when he's talking about the forces of production. So today, when we're worrying about the pandemic, right, we're lucky that we have available to us now, right, the idea of a vaccine. We now know how to vaccinate people and immunize them against certain kinds of diseases, right? The availability of vaccines, that would be for Marx an example of a force of production, something that wasn't always available to human beings. Back in the medieval period, of course, before the modern period, before Edward Jenner did his discovered vaccines, right? I think it was Edward. We didn't have that force available to us. That's what he means when he talks about the forces of production, the powers that are available to us at any given historical moment for producing things, for producing stuff from the world and from each other that might solve important human problems. Relations of production, for Marx, refer to schemes of interpersonal control that are involved in the way in which the forces of production actually get deployed at particular moments in human history. And here he's thinking especially of things like legal rights and privileges, forms of ownership, forms of private property, the actual overt coercive domination of certain social groups by others, economic classes, political classes, and so forth. These are, for Marx, the relations of production, right? This is the particular way in which groups of human beings are commandeered organizationally into various concerted forms of production under the protection of certain kinds of legal rights and legal privileges, under a certain regime of property ownership and so forth, the exercise of certain forms of political power and political coercion. That's the way in which production is actually concretely organized in particular social settings, a particular historical period. When Marx refers to the means of production, he is referring to a subset of the forces of production. He's referring to those non-human factors, those non-human resources that are available for use in production at particular times, right? And he's thinking here of raw materials, economic resources, equipment, technology, factories, and of course, wealth and capital that is available to certain groups but not others for investing in various kinds of productive enterprises, right? So if you're born into a wealthy family and your parents die and bequeath to you a large sum of money and perhaps a farm, right, or perhaps a company, or perhaps some factory that uses some super duper equipment to manufacture certain kinds of articles, you inherit certain means of production, right? Non-human factors that are available for use in various kinds of productive enterprises. So Marx has this distinction between the forces, relations, and the means of production. And so that's how he understands these various categories. Another important technical term, which people often get wrong in Marx, is this idea of surplus value, right? Surplus value for Marx refers to any wealth that human societies produce above and beyond what the members of that society need for their basic subsistence and reproduction, right? And Marx thinks that virtually all human societies, beyond some point of basic natural subsistence, virtually all human societies produce some surplus value, right? They don't just produce enough for all of us to get by and to meet our immediate physical needs. They also produce a bunch of wealth and value above and beyond what is basically required to subsist in given historical conditions. And anything that is produced that is in that way above and beyond bare survival, bare subsistence, is for Marx defined as surplus value. Notice, by the way, that Marx understands the idea of subsistence not as just bare physical survival, but something that itself varies historically, right? What human beings need to be able to basically function in life will be relative to their social circumstances, right? So to take an example from today, right? I mean, I think most of you would be prepared to accept that in order to basically function as a member of society, able to take advantage of the opportunities in your society, it's pretty much required now that you have access to Wi-Fi or some access to online content, because increasingly economic cooperation requires that you have access to the internet, right? If you don't have access to that, then you're really not at a very basic level of self reproduction. You need to have that in order to basically function, right? And so for Marx today, Wi-Fi would not be something that would be part of surplus value. The provision of Wi-Fi to everyone in society, that would be part of what is required to allow the human species to reproduce. So surplus value is going to be whatever societies produce on top of that, right? And of course, in capitalist societies, Marx thinks that that surplus value is predominantly held by the bourgeoisie, by the members of the commercial class, by the people who run the businesses, by the CEOs, and so on and so forth, right? As I've said, for Marx, virtually all human societies of any complexity produce some surplus value. They produce some additional wealth on top of what is necessary to provide for individuals' basic subsistence and functional needs within that society. But how different social orders, how different modes of economic association produce surplus value is sometimes fairly clear, and sometimes it's not so clear. And one of Marx's central points in his criticisms of capitalism is he wants to say that the way in which surplus value is extracted in capitalist society is mystified here. It's fairly clear, for example, in feudal societies where surplus value comes from. Right, the nobility have all of this extra wealth. Where are they getting that extra wealth from? Well, they have an arrangement with their serfs on their strips on their estates, under which the serfs cultivate lettuce and bread and so forth. And each week or each month or whatever, the serf gives a certain proportion of their product from the land to the nobility. Right, they get to keep whatever is left over for themselves, right? And in that system, Marx thinks it's fairly clear where the surplus value is coming from. The surplus value is, suppose I'm a serf on my strip. I produce 10 cabbages a week, say. I'm obligated to give my lord 6 of those cabbages, right? Those 6 cabbages go to the lord. They become part of his property. I keep the remaining 4 cabbages. I get to live off them. I get to make cabbage soup and all the rest of it. There it's fairly clear where the surplus value is coming from and where it's going. It's coming from the serfs' labor on the strips, and it's going to the nobility in the form of this contribution that the serfs are obligated to provide the lords in return for their protection, right? But Marx thinks that under capitalism, the extraction of surplus value is mystified in certain ways. It's not clear where the surplus value comes from. And part of what Marx is trying to do in his critical analysis of capitalism is to explain how it's mystified and how surplus value and its extortion under capitalist conditions is in fact going on, even though we don't see it overtly in the way that we do under other epochs, and especially under feudalism, right? When Marx uses the language of mystification, this doesn't particularly imply deliberate concealment. It's not that people are hiding something knowingly. Rather, he thinks that the operation of ideological beliefs that develop in capitalism have the effect of distracting attention away. Whether this is intentional or not is a separate question, and in fact Marx thinks it's unintentional. The ideological beliefs that develop under capitalism have the effect of distracting attention away from the process whereby surplus value is extracted under capitalist conditions. So what he wants to do in his account of capitalism is to explain how surplus value is, after all, extracted in capitalism. Once you understand that, Marx thinks, you'll start to see that capitalism is in fact a system of systematic exploitation, alienation, and therefore of oppression and unfreedom. Right, that's what he's aiming for. So given all of these technical terms, right, you can now, I hope, see that Marx's definition of different historical epochs in terms of their economic formations, feudalism, ancient slavery, capitalism, perhaps some future communist mode of production that is to come, right, he defines and classifies these historical epochs by particular enduring patterns in the way in which the forces and relations and means of production are configured, and relatedly, by the particular ways in which those configurations extract surplus value, how they produce more than what is actually needed for basic subsistence, and where that surplus value goes and who controls it. So capitalism, for Marx, represents a set of relations of production involving, as you know by now, a certain pattern of class control in which a dominant class of bourgeois, people who have wealth and control capital investment in society, confront the rest of society, which is largely, for Marx, a group of workers who have nothing to sell but their labor, right? So what you see under capitalism is a distinctive configuration of what he calls the relations of production. And that is manifested, he thinks, in a certain pattern of class control. You've got one dominant class with most of the wealth. They control how production and investment is conducted. Everybody else, the working class, depends on those decisions for their livelihood. At the same time, capitalism is going to involve a distinctive mechanism, a distinctive process of extracting from the economic process itself surplus value, that is, greater economic wealth than is necessary for the reproduction of the species, for basic subsistence and everyone's basic functioning in life. And the bourgeoisie, in Marx's story, they are the class that controls the means of production, right? They're the ones who get most of the surplus value, he's going to argue. They're therefore the ones who have the wealth to command raw materials, to command land, to command other kinds of commodities, physical plants, factories, farms, the infrastructure that goes into the production of commodities and so forth. They control the means of production, and everybody else is dependent on the bourgeoisie for their livelihoods, right? That's the way Marx understands capitalism. And his analysis of capitalism, which I'm clearly, as I see the time, dripping away here, his analysis of capitalism is intended to lay this configuration bare and to explain how its actual operation is obscured and mystified, in the way I was talking about before, by bourgeois ideology. And he's particularly concerned here by bourgeois ideology in the form of what is known at the time as political economy. And in 19th century parlance, political economy just means what we would think of as economics, right? A kind of quasi-scientific, academic body of scholarship and inquiry that is seeking to understand how economic systems work, and when they work well and when they work badly. And the great classical economists of the 18th and 19th century, figures like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, this French political economist, Frédéric, I think, Bastiat, they are the great political economists of the age. And Marx thinks, right, that their account of how the modern economy works is infected by bourgeois ideology that mystifies these relations of production, that fails to adequately explain the origin and nature of surplus value under capitalism, and therefore is inattentive and cannot fully embrace the way in which capitalism is truly an oppressive and alienating system, right? So what he's trying to do in his analysis of capitalism is to show that the picture of capitalism that you get in figures like Smith, Ricardo, and Bastiat as a system of natural liberty, as promoting freedom more generally, is actually an illusion, right? It's a mystifying ideological illusion that conceals the reality, the brutal, oppressive, alienating, exploitative reality of actual capitalist social relations. So let me end this lecture by describing what I take Marx's target in this analysis to be, his critical target. And if you look at the Marx Engels reader on page 343, you get in a potted form what I think Marx is particularly trying to argue against, right? He thinks of the political economists and bourgeois ideology more generally as refracting an image of capitalism as a system involving the circulation and exchange of goods, services, and what he calls commodities, in which the following hold. First of all, Each member of the economy is treated as an independent, equal, free person. Each is a voluntary chooser. We don't have slavery anymore. No one is owned as chattel property by anybody else. Each confronts every other person as an equal with rights to buy and sell on a consensual, voluntary basis. Marx understands that that's the picture, and in many ways it's an attractive picture of capitalist social relations that you get in classical political economy, and of course that you still get today among apologists for free market societies. Libertarians like Robert Nozick, those of you who've read him, will know that this is also the picture of capitalism that you get even today in libertarian free marketeers. Like Nozick and contemporary free market libertarians, Marx's political economists, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Bastiat, people like that, they take capitalism to be essentially just because it involves merely voluntary exchange, in that the rights and freedoms and private property of all participants is respected, at least in the ideal case. And the law exists in particular under capitalism to ensure that each individual's rights receive the full protection of the state. And that, under capitalist conditions, is understood as the primary duty of justice that the state then takes on. It's very much like Locke, for example. And in some moods, it's also the view that you get in Hobbes and Mill, where Mill says in utilitarianism that the state should enforce the rights of private property for the sake of individual security, and that's the essence of justice, right? Marx is going to say, well, yeah, absolutely, this is classic capitalist ideology. Capitalism is just because to the extent that it goes well and all rights and freedoms are properly respected, you have a system here of voluntary exchange, and that's what makes capitalism a just social arrangement. That's part of his target. The relevant standard of justice and fairness is universal, right? This idea of respect for consent, respect for freedom of contract, respect for the privileges of private ownership. That is understood under capitalist conditions to be a universal expectation of justice and fairness. He also has in view the picture of capitalism as an economic system that is self-stabilizing, right? Here he has in mind the famous image of Adam Smith's invisible hand. If you let each individual pursue their own self-interest in their own way, as long as everybody respects the rights of transactants to agree or disagree according to their voluntary will with any trades that you propose, then the overall system will bring prosperity, but also be self-sustaining and harmonious and stable, right? Marx is one of these figures who strongly resists the idea that capitalism is a self-equilibrating system. He says, no, capitalism is actually profoundly unstable, and I'll say more about that in some of the future lectures. He also has in mind the view that since everything that happens, at least in the ideal case, under capitalist conditions, is subject to voluntary consent, everything is consensual in that sense, there can't really be any deep forms of coercion and exploitation present, right? So he's wanting to contest the claim associated with the political economists and apologists for capitalism more generally, that since under ideal conditions capitalism is completely consensual, it can't really be a system of coercive domination or exploitation. Again, Marx wants to say, no, that's not true on closer inspection. He also wants to reject the idea that capitalism is a communal mode of production that rationally coordinates needs and powers, that guarantees, as you might put it, non-alienation, right? And we've already seen some of the ways in which he thinks it fails to satisfy that desideratum, because we've already seen some of the ways in which he thinks that under capitalism, workers' powers are commandeered for the sake of the system and not for the sake of their true needs and interests, right? So Marx again wants to criticize that. And finally, he wants to contest he doesn't want to contest, he wants to at least qualify the picture of capitalism under which everybody involved in the exchange of goods, services, and commodities receives their proper due. labor receives appropriate wages, landowners receive appropriate rents, capital receives appropriate returns on its investment in the form of profits to those entrepreneurs and factory owners and businessmen and commercial people who invest their wealth in productive enterprises, right? So everyone gets what is owed to them. And again, Marx wants to say, not exactly that that's wrong, but to think that that's sufficient to establish that capitalism is a good system is to make a certain kind of mistake. All right. So this is the target of Marx's criticisms of capitalism. I'll stop this lecture here now and talk about the technical ways in which he wants to reject that view or qualify it or call it into question in the next lecture. Thanks very much for listening.